Hello, I'm Annie Davey. I've been telling Bible stories to children for many years, and I've got some lovely ones to tell you from the New Testament in this section here. If you want to know about the background, where I got some of the background detail from, you can look it up on the web on truthortradition.com or www.korky.info, where we've written a book called Jesus, Faith and Fact. So it's all in there somewhere, but there's some interesting things here which you may not know. You may think you do know the stories, but wait and see. So let's see what we've got. I've just had an email from a friend in Africa, and he was quite cross because he said, well, not cross so much, sad really, because he said nobody had sent him a Christmas card, a real one, and nobody had sent him a birthday card, which was last week, and he's rather sad that you get the odd email ones now, but he says not the same as having a real card. So I've made a note in my diary that next year we must send him a real birthday card and a real Christmas card and probably a real Easter card from the friends at church as well. Now his name is David Seranjogi, and he lives in Uganda. And we met him years ago when my husband started working in Uganda to teach people how to use these big boards and how to share the stories of Jesus with the people there. Well, David, as he was a little boy, he didn't know his dad, and he lived with his mum and several brothers and sisters in a little hut just like this. And it was about 40 miles from the capital city in Kampala, and there's a disease over there which a lot of people get, brought by mosquitoes. It's called malaria. And one week his mum got malaria really badly, and so did his brothers and sisters, I don't know, 5 or 6 of them, and by the end of the week all of them had died. It was awful, and he was about 9 years old, and there was nothing to do but call the local villagers, and they made graves for them all and mounted it up with grass. And over there the family is buried in the back garden or the front garden, depending where there's room. So there were all these new graves, and poor little David was all on his own. He just had his shorts and t-shirt and no money, nothing. There was nothing left in the house. So he thought, well, what do I do? And then he remembered that at school he'd been taught to do this. He'd been taught to trust Jesus. So he looked up at the big blue sky and he said, well, Jesus, I don't know what to do. So I'm going to go to Kampala and see if I can find somebody there to look after me. Is that all right? And he didn't feel wrong about it. So he set off and he walked 40 miles. That's a long, long way, all the way from his little hut, which he had to leave behind because the villagers said, we've got too many children already. We can't look after you. And so he set off and he walked all the way. He managed to find bananas to eat on the way, and people would give him something, perhaps a bit of bread, or he'd find something to drink. He managed to get to Kampala, to the big city, and it's a big city like any big city now in England. And there was a great big hotel there called the Sheraton. And as he went through the streets, he began to notice there were other children peeping at him round corners, and one of them came up to him and said, hello, are you on your own? He said, yes. Would you like to come with me? I'll show you where to get something to eat. Ah, yes, said David. And so this child took him, and he found that there were a whole host of other children living on the street. And they did quite well, because round the back of the Sheraton Hotel, where all the rich visitors would go, every night at about 10 o'clock, they would put the waste food into a great big skip at the back of the hotel. And as soon as the man had gone inside from putting the food into the skip, the children would climb into the skip. And they'd get the best food in Kampala because they couldn't serve it again to the guests in the posh hotel. So they would stuff their pockets and their mouths and their tummies with this good food. And then they would try and find somewhere to sleep that was out of the rain. And somewhere, it gets quite cold at night in Kampala, even in the city. And so that went on for quite a few years. And I suppose about 3 or 4 years he lived as a street child, begging and stealing and finding food at the back of the Sheraton Hotel, until they heard that the president, Idi Amin, in those days, was rounding up the street children because he didn't like the look of them for the tourists, and he was shipping them off in big trucks to his sugar plantations outside the city to work for nothing. They were slaves, really. And David thought to himself, well, I don't want to be shipped off out there. I'll go and get a job. So he found a garage. He liked cars. And in Uganda, if you want somebody to trust your business, and you know that they trust Jesus, you put Jesus' name above the business. So it was a Jesus garage. So he thought, right, well, I can trust them. We actually saw a place called the Jesus Victoria pub when we were out there, which is rather fun. But the Jesus garage, he knocked on the door, and a big man came out and looked round. He wasn't very big, and he looked down and said, oh, what do you want? And he tried to make himself look very big and tall. And he said, please, sir, I want a job. I want to work. So he looked down on him and thought, well, took pity on him. He said, right, I'll tell you what, you can be my sweeper up. And so he got him a uniform, which was much too big, a pair of old overalls, and rolled them up so that he didn't trip over them. And he said, you can sleep in that old car around the back there. That can be your place to sleep. So he had a place to sleep for the first time in years, and he had a job. And so at 14, he started working for this garage man. And the garage man was a Christian. He'd learned to trust Jesus many years earlier, and he was really kind to David and helped him and taught him. And eventually, David, at 19, he became a proper mechanic, a qualified mechanic, and he used to adjust the steering alignment because the roads in Uganda are really bad. They're all potholes. You don't drive on the left or the right, you just drive on the bit that hasn't got potholes in. It's quite dangerous driving over there. But he became a steering alignment specialist. And he also became a real Christian, because this garage man told him that there was no disgrace anymore about not knowing who his father was, which some of the people had told him. And the garage man pointed out to him that there was this wonderful verse in the Bible, in a book called Romans chapter 8, verse 1, which says, there is now no condemnation to those people who are in Jesus, people who love and follow Jesus. And so he decided he didn't want to be called David anymore. He was going to be called Romans 8:1. We just call him Romans nowadays, not Romans 8:1, but he's got it on his hat, Romans 8:1, and he's got some work which he calls Romans 8:1 Ministries. He was so thrilled with that verse because he'd felt dreadful about it all those years. And so Romans 8:1 had a proper job and a pay packet. And with his first pay packet, he rented a hut. He rented a hut here. And he adopted 6 street boys because he knew how marvellous it was to have a home and somewhere to live and somebody to take care of them. So he managed to look after 6 little boys who, like him, had had to live on the street. And eventually he met and married a lovely lady called Sarah, and they began to have children of their own. Well, with 8 of them in the hut, it was too many. So they built another hut behind that one. And then they had to build another hut because they found more children. And then they had a hut behind a hut behind a hut behind a hut. It was too much. And they realised, actually, babies need schooling, don't they? So Sarah started a little school in another garage. And the local neighbour said, oh, are you running a school? Can I send my children to your school? And before they knew it, they had a primary school. First a nursery, then a primary school. Then they needed a secondary school. And all this time, Romans wasn't earning very much, and they didn't know where the next meal was coming from. But a bit like George Muller's children in Bristol years earlier, there was always something for them to eat. And they kept adopting more children. And when I met Sarah a few years ago, I said to her, Sarah, how come you adopted all these children? So she said, well, you see, Annie, if a friend comes to you and says, Sarah, I am dying, I have this horrible disease, and please will you look after my little boy or my little girl when I'm gone? You can't say, no, I won't, can you? You couldn't, could you? So she just adopted them, and their family grew and grew and grew. I think they had 8 children of their own and 15 adopted children in the end. And they had to build a proper school. So they built a school like that. It's now much, much bigger, lots more buildings to it. And they called it Trinity Children's Centre. And of course, those children then needed secondary school. So a bit further away, he found some land and he managed to buy it with help from churches and friends. And he's built Centenary High School. He just doesn't stop. He sees an opportunity or a need and he gets on with it. And all the time people know him as Romans. And he decided that for a career, he would like to serve God by being a minister in the church in Uganda. So he became Reverend Romans 8:1, Reverend David Saranjogi. And we got to know him through his church work because his bishop wanted him to learn how to do sketchboard and how to reach lots of people in a very engaging way. So we got to know Romans. And one of his phrases is this one here. Is no worries, because he learnt to trust Jesus. I wouldn't say he's never been anxious about things, because I'm sure he has. The thing is that they expect about 30 or 40 children every year to be orphaned, because there's a lot of disease there. I don't know what it's like now since lockdown. But instead of saying to the children they couldn't come to school anymore because their parents couldn't pay any fees, they would just build some more bunks and make space for the children to live at the school. And so we would send some money out to him and I would send some books out to him and everybody tried to help. And so he's now got a nursery school, 2 primary schools and a secondary school. But that wasn't enough. He decided that there wasn't enough hospital care for people in Uganda. They hadn't got the National Health Service like we have, they should have, but it hasn't quite worked how they hoped. And so he decided he would build a hospital. He's going to call it the Double Cure Medical Centre, because it wasn't just to cure people's bodies, but to cure their souls as well. And the first building that he built was the Good Samaritan Chapel. And the first person that he employed was an old vicar who needed some work and who was very happy to live at the chapel and look after people who needed praying for. And now, this is probably 10 years later, he's not only built the chapel, but he's built a proper hospital, and above the hospital is a nurses' teaching area, and above that is accommodation for the churches to live in, the nurses to live in. He really is an amazing man. Wherever he sees an opportunity, he'll take it. He found there was an island on Lake Victoria, which is used as a prison for children. And they had nothing, they just put the children on the island, and they left some food there for them. But he organises to go over with a team once a week, and he does games with them, and he teaches them things, and particularly he's teaching them to trust Jesus. And so that prison for children has become a hopeful place, a place where children actually look forward to him coming and are not just left to run wild. It's not good for them, is it? You wouldn't like it if somebody left you to run wild and didn't look after you at all. And then he noticed that there were lots of fish in the lake. So he organised that his son should have a fish farm. And they now take truckloads of fresh fish to the market. And that's a business for one of his sons who's grown up. He's just got so many ideas. And then he realised that, early on he realised that the maize that he had to buy to feed the children to make flour, it was very expensive if he bought it from the special government outlets. So he got some money from a church in Bristol, it was called Pip and J in those days, and he built a maize mill himself. So the farmers would bring him their sacks of maize to be ground into flour, and they didn't pay him in money, they paid him in sacks of flour, which is what he needed. He's just got so many ideas. And when you start trusting Jesus and following him, he gives you all kinds of good ideas about how people could be helped, how business could be run, how people can get on with things in a good way and make a positive difference to people's lives. So if God gives you a good idea that might help somebody, try it and see. In my daughter's road in London, there's a little girl who's just 7, and outside her house she puts a little table and some little cakes that she's made, and she calls it her Kindness Cafe. And Millie gets lots of people coming past on their way to school, on the way back home from school, and they'll stop and give her a few pennies for a cake, or even no money at all if it's a kindness cafe. They can have a little drink of lemonade or something. And she's only 7. So I bet you could think of something that you could do that would be a blessing to other people. It needn't cost very much money. Maybe it's going through your toys and giving those away. You can think of it. Ask God, trust Jesus, and like Romans, you'll find he gives you all kinds of wonderful ideas. So God bless you and give you some good ideas as you seek to serve him.